This is my learning experience from taking this Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander class. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I learned. And what's probably more important is how my perspective has changed on some of the topics presented in the class. This is my digital story. Coming to Australia, I knew very little about its Aboriginal history and culture and issues. And so one of the reasons I chose this course is to learn more about the Aboriginal people and their culture. During this class, I've learned so much up to this point about a lot of the history, from the beginning of the people 40,000 years ago through the colonization of Australia to the modern day. Of course, there are many important events, people, legislative movements, and displays that are integral to understanding many of the issues and cultural movements that make up the current Australian Aboriginal identity, from the initial contact of the white settlers to the current day institutionalized racism and backlash, the reservations, children's homes, and stolen generations in between. But one thing in particular struck me throughout this process. The arts and cultural production of Aboriginal identity through modern means, like street art and film, fascinated me. Of course, this is not to discredit the important role that the history and struggle of the people have played. But by doing this, I meant to acknowledge how these events play into both the deeply seated cultural understanding of the people that goes on when creating these types of works of art, and also the larger implications that these events might have had. The idea of a quote-unquote Western art mediums or modernistic and urban art forms, but at the same time displaying Aboriginal culture, issues, and people, and most importantly that these forms of art are done by Aboriginal artists, often gets cast in the shadow behind what the Western world sees as almost traditional Aboriginal art, like face paint and elaborate dance routines, among other things. While these forms of expression obviously factor into the equation, they can often drown out some of the other mediums of expression, or worse still, wrongly discredit any other form that doesn't resemble what people's perception of Aboriginal art ought to look like. One thing that particularly struck me was during Warrabal Weatherall's presentation on his street-style art and sculpture. The first and foremost thing that stuck with me was the amount of layers of cultural heritage that went into each individual work of art that he produced. For example, on this picture, there is so much meaning to unpack from what appears on the surface to be just a relatively straightforward piece of artwork. Many of the kind of hidden meanings from his piece would not be so obvious to someone who's not as familiar with Aboriginal culture or traditional art forms. For example, the use of the chevron pattern or the lines across the painting, which hold special meanings within certain Aboriginal cultures. What was even more striking to me, however, was the fact that even with the same amount of background information regarding the piece, someone who comes from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background might have a completely different takeaway than someone who came from another culture or ethnic background. At first, this probably appears very obvious. The idea that people are influenced and shaped by their culture and cultural experiences is not really at all incredibly profound. However, I never really considered how this might translate into works that are designed to be more digestible to the general public. More than that though, it really forced me to reconcile with how I was conditioned to think about what gives art its meaning and how culture influences an individual's perception of the various layers and interpretations of a particular piece of art. This piece of art also was incredibly interesting to me. It's also by Warrabal Weatherall, and as he said in the lecture, it's laden with metaphor and hidden meaning, just like the work I just talked about. What I really find interesting about this is how the artwork is used as a form of cultural resistance. Of course, art has long been used as a form of cultural resistance to various oppressed and minority groups and peoples. I think that, though, because of this particular use of art in this form, it kind of challenged me more than other mediums of expression to consider the artist's purpose. It's not really at all that other forms don't hold meaning or agency, but I think that the deliberate use of the metaphors and the hidden meanings in this piece of art made it more relatable or more easily relatable to the viewer while still holding a deep significance to the cause and without sacrificing the integrity of the message. And it allowed me to connect to the art in a way that I wasn't really able to do in other kind of examples or other mediums that we've looked at up to that point within the course. I suppose there are some wider implications of how my perspective might have changed that are applicable outside the scope of this course. Although after leaving Australia, I most likely won't have to take a great consideration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. I think that the wider appreciation and understanding of the means of cultural production, heritage, and storytelling will hopefully allow me to appreciate a wider lens of perspectives and experiences.